"Buddy, get down from there!" yelled Ethan, clutching what was left of a shredded couch cushion in one hand while trying to snatch a piece of fabric from the puppy's jaws. Chaos had been a constant since Max arrived. The little Labrador mix bounced across the sofa, oblivious to the stress flooding the small living room. Grace appeared from the kitchen, carrying a plate with the remains of her breakfast. "Again with your messes, buddy," she said wearily, setting the plate on the coffee table. She glanced at Ethan, now chasing the dog around the room. It was a ridiculous sight, the man chasing the dog, both crashing into furniture, knocking over books, and adding to the chaos. Suddenly, Buddy darted toward the door, which had been left slightly ajar. Before either of them could react, the puppy pushed it open with his nose and bolted out into the street. "You've got to be kidding me," Grace exclaimed, grabbing her keys and rushing after Ethan, who was already sprinting after the dog. The street was alive with activity, vendors shouting about fresh produce, kids kicking soccer balls, and neighbors chatting on front porches. Amid the commotion, Buddy raced ahead, ignoring his owner's desperate calls. Ethan almost tripped trying to catch up, while Grace, a few steps behind, screamed. The main road was just a few yards away, and cars sped past with little room to stop. Summoning all his strength, he lunged forward, grabbing Buddy by the collar just as the dog was about to step into the traffic. The screech of brakes and a horn blaring filled the air as Ethan yanked Buddy back onto the sidewalk. Both tumbled to the ground as a car sped by, missing them by inches. Grace ran up, her face pale with panic. Ethan lay on the ground, panting heavily, still clutching Buddy, who wagged his tail enthusiastically as if it had all been a game. "This can't go on," Grace said, breaking the tense silence. Ethan nodded, still holding the dog. Max, the tiny tornado disguised as a Labrador, had no idea how close he had come to disaster. To him, it was all part of an adventure. But to Grace and Ethan, it was clear their new life together in suburban Atlanta was going to be far more challenging than they had imagined. A week after the near miss on the road, their home no longer resembled the peaceful haven it once was. It was a battlefield. Grace sat at the kitchen table, trying to prepare her lesson plans for the middle school where she taught. The demands of her job required focus, something increasingly scarce these days. "Ethan, where's Buddy?" she called out, frustration creeping into her voice. "In the yard, I think," he replied from the kitchen, where he was chopping tomatoes for tacos. Just then, a loud crash echoed from outside. Grace rushed to the yard. Buddy had knocked over a large bag of soil Ethan had bought for the garden. Dirt was everywhere, covering the patio tiles and the puppy's paws as he gleefully dug into the bag. "This is a disaster!" Grace yelled. She tried to catch him, but Buddy bolted back into the house, leaving a trail of muddy paw prints. Grace chased him, arriving just in time to see him leap onto the kitchen table, devouring the tomatoes Ethan had just chopped. Before anyone could stop him, Buddy jumped to the floor, a knife clattering down beside him. The sharp sound froze everyone in their tracks. "That's enough, Buddy!" Ethan shouted as Grace swept up the dirt and food scraps. That night, after hours of cleaning, they collapsed onto their battered couch. Exhaustion and silence filled the room. "Maybe we're not cut out for this," Grace said softly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, alarmed. "Us. I thought this would be easier, but between Buddy, your restaurant, and my job, it feels like everything's falling apart." Rushing to investigate, they found Buddy tearing into a box of Grace's keepsakes. Photos and letters were strewn everywhere, many damaged beyond repair. Grace froze, clutching a torn photo of her late parents. Tears welled up in her eyes as Ethan tried to comfort her, but she pulled away. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan. Something has to change." The next morning, he began packing Buddy's belongings into a box. Grace woke to the sound of him zipping up the dog's travel bag. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused. "You're right. This isn't working. I'm taking him back to the shelter." The door remained open, silence pressing down like a weight. That afternoon, a storm rolled in as Ethan worked at his restaurant. The windows rattled under the force of the wind, and rain seeped through cracks in the roof. Back home, Grace battled leaks with towels and buckets. The relentless noise of the storm kept her on edge. A sound from the back door made her turn abruptly. It was open, and Buddy was gone. "Buddy!" she called, panic rising as she grabbed her coat and stepped into the downpour. The streets were flooded, debris floating in the rising water. She called his name over and over until she heard a faint bark. Following the sound, she found him trapped near a fast-moving current. Wading through water up to her knees, she struggled to reach him, finally lifting him into her arms. By the time she made it back, both were drenched and shivering. Minutes later, Ethan arrived, soaked and muddy. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed. "Buddy ran off. I almost lost him," Grace said, her voice trembling. The weight of the moment settled over them. Finally, Grace spoke. Fixing leaks and cleaning debris consumed their time. But when Buddy was diagnosed with hip dysplasia, their personal struggles took a back seat. The veterinarian explained that his boundless energy had worn down his joints and that he'd need constant care. Caring for Buddy forced Ethan and Grace to reconnect. They had to coordinate schedules and make joint decisions. Slowly, through the shared responsibility, they began to heal. One night, as they applied an ointment to Buddy's legs, Ethan broke the ice. "Remember when we adopted him? We thought this would be practice for having kids." Grace noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Customers loved seeing Buddy, now calm, lounging in a corner. As Buddy aged, his health declined. One day, Ethan found him unable to rise. They rushed to the vet, who confirmed advanced heart failure. In the backyard, where Buddy had once raced as a puppy, they said goodbye, Grace whispered through tears. Grace and Ethan planted a memorial garden in his honor, and their love for each other grew stronger through their shared grief. Years later, as their children played among the flowers, Grace turned to Ethan. "Do you think we knew how much he'd change our lives when we adopted him?"